All right, Shlomi Raz, come on out from Eleusis. Guys, give Shlomi a round of applause. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? All right, great. So just a quick background on Eleusis. I don't know if there's a slideshow here. So the story of Eleusis in some ways is my story. So before I started off in psychedelics, I was on Wall Street. And so I left Goldman Sachs in 2008 to pursue a lifelong interest in psychology. I became a therapist, and it was during my time as a therapist that I came to realize that the current approaches to psychotherapy and psychiatry really were kind of falling short. I thought maybe I need to learn more. I went back to school. I enrolled at NYU. And around 2011, 2012, I came across this research coming out of Johns Hopkins on psychedelics. I was really blown away by the initial results that they were seeing, that a single dose of psilocybin could have long-lasting effects. Some people rating it as the most meaningful experience of their lives, roughly 30% of all the volunteers in their studies. And so I was intrigued. And the more I dug into it, being the old man in grad school, the more I realized that there was this massive, profound potential in psychedelics to transform them into medicines. But there was a fundamental problem. There was a last mile challenge. How do you take a psychedelic drug therapy and make it an accessible, affordable medicine? Something that could actually put a dent in depression, put a dent in substance abuse, rather than just being something for the elite or for the very few. And so in 2014 and 15, we started doing research. We conducted the first corporate-sponsored clinical trials in the world with LSD in 2016. And unfortunately, I came to the conclusion that LSD and psilocybin are just too long. It just takes too much time. The patients were exhausted, the therapists were exhausted, everyone was tired. Logistically, it was an incredible challenge. And so it was disappointing, and I don't want to put a kind of cast a cloud on this event, but it kind of taught me very quickly that to really scale psychedelic drug therapy, you had to meet patients where they are, not just in Metro New York, right, but in the suburbs of San Antonio. You had to make the psychedelic drug therapy cost-effective. You know, the magic words in the United States are in-network, right? If it's not in-network, it's usually not accessible. And certainly, ketamine clinics have demonstrated that people are willing to pay out of pocket, but that's still a very small fraction of the unmet need of the patient population. So between 2017, 18, and today, Eleusis has been developing what we think is the approach to really transform psychedelic drug therapy into a modern medicine. And that's what I'll share with you today. So I don't know if I can advance the slide or not with this. I don't know exactly what this is. Oh, the green button. Great. So psilocybin has promising efficacy data, right? And I'll get into that in a second. And clearly, depression is a massive unmet need. It is the leading cause of global disability. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, those trends are going down in terms of mortality, in terms of loss of life, in terms of cost. Whereas mental health and the unmet need in mental health is actually out of control. It is a crisis, and the more drugs we're developing don't seem to be putting even a dent in that growing epidemic. Psilocybin has demonstrated some very promising signals for efficacy, but there are problems. We think that encapsulating psilocybin is only halfway to a modern medicine, right? If Pfizer would have been developing psilocybin and they saw the results thus far, they would have said, aha, this is promising, but there's no way we're going to put it in a capsule. And the reason why is that, first off, when you take psilocybin orally, it is highly variable in terms of its absorption. Some people have an effect relatively quickly, others don't feel anything. Some require a much higher dose than others, and that variability can happen not just between people, but within the same person over different periods of time. You have prolonged administration, 4 to 6 hours. How do you convince an insurance company to cover that? How do you convince someone who has a day job to take 4 to 6 hours out of their work to come in for a psychedelic drug therapy? And then finally, optimization. How do you halt a therapy if it's not going well? How do you optimize it by combining it potentially with other therapies? Those are the questions that we were seeking to address in our development of Eleusis. So first off, proof of concept has been established. The Imperial College New England Journal of Medicine publication on psilocybin, as well as the recent Compass phase 2b study results. What do these results tell us? Well, to Eleusis, what they tell us is the drug effect is immediate, day one, right? You're seeing a dramatic reduction in symptoms associated with psilocybin. What does that say? It says that psychotherapy may be a boost or maybe synergetic with this drug, but there is a clear drug effect, right? Psychotherapy doesn't create that type of response. No psychotherapy does. And so that fundamentally you have to make sure that the drug therapy itself is optimized. And that's what we're seeking to do. The problem is, as I mentioned, variability. When you look at university research and you look at the variability of the dose and the effect, what you can see here is that it's just not ready for prime time. Some people don't get enough, some people get too much. It's prolonged, and it's difficult to optimize. What we are developing is psilocin, the active ingredient in psilocybin, the magic in the magic mushroom, essentially. We have created a salt form of psilocin, which is stable. Psilocin traditionally was never kind of an eligible drug candidate because it was unstable. It would quickly oxidize. What we've done is we've created a stable form of psilocin, and we've recently received notice of allowance from the US Patent Office. So arguably our IP foundation is the strongest in the industry. And what we've developed here is that's the first innovation. Can we deliver the active ingredient in psilocybin directly? So yes. But the major innovation, and this seems counterintuitive when thinking about drug development, is the method of administration. We believe that the optimal method of administration for psilocin is via IV infusion. Now, traditionally in drug development, you go from IV to oral, right? That's the way it goes. We do not fundamentally believe that oral psilocybin will ever be sold at Walgreens or CVS. It's just, we don't see that in the next 10 years, 20 years, maybe 50 years. So where will this type of drug therapy be administered? Well, in specialized facilities. We already know that there's about 300 or 400 ketamine clinics in the United States, and that number is growing. We know that there's about 10,000 IV infusion clinics in the United States. The question is, how do you utilize that existing infrastructure? And the answer is you deliver the drug via infusion. When you deliver psilocin via infusion, you have an immediate drug effect. It doesn't take 40 minutes before the drug starts taking effect. You have effects literally in 2 minutes. And when you stop the infusion, we believe that the drug effect will quickly wear off. And essentially the patient will be back to baseline within 30 to 40 minutes. And so now you're looking at a treatment window that looks a lot more like S-ketamine, ketamine, than it does psilocybin or LSD. And so we think this is a sweet spot. Unlike some of the other drug therapies that are in development, for example, 5-MeO DMT or DMT, psilocybin is a more gentle therapy, right? It is not an existential sledgehammer. And so we think that's going to be a lot of a comfort for patients who are not professional psychonauts. Further, when you deliver it via infusion, there's a tremendous comfort that comes from the fact that when the infusion starts, you know that the drug is coming on, and when the infusion stops, then that's it. The drug effects will start to wear off. That provides clinical reliability. For the clinician, they know exactly when the patient is feeling the drug effects and when the patient can be moved from the treatment room to a recovery room or be released from care. You cannot say that with oral psilocybin. Oral psilocybin effects are variable. Some patients only start feeling effects after an hour and a half or longer. You can imagine patients being released too soon because they simply don't feel any effects, and all of a sudden in the waiting room, the effects start to kick in. That variability is problematic in a care delivery context. And so the practicality of this approach, we think, is going to be a tremendous advantage for clinicians. Now, what are we trying to do with this infusion approach? We are targeting a specific amount of serotonin 2A receptor occupancy. Serotonin 2A receptors mediate the psychedelic drug effects. Essentially, when you get to a plasma level of somewhere between 10 to 20 nanograms per milliliter in plasma, you reach roughly 70% receptor occupancy. And that's the sweet spot for the psychedelic drug effect, the intense drug effect. And that comes based on academic research and PET imaging. And what's interesting is that when you reach that receptor occupancy, you get that very profound effect, that mystical experience. So roughly, when you get to that 10 to 20 nanogram per milliliter range, you're now talking about people feeling a 7 to 10 on a subjective scale of how intense is the drug effect. The core hypothesis that we are going to prove in our clinical trials is that we can achieve this type of receptor occupancy reliably via infusion, that we can reliably have this type of intense effect, and that crucially, we can have this effect that then comes off once the infusion stops. So within 30 to 40 minutes, patient is back to baseline. This graph basically shows getting patients into that sweet spot of 10 to 20 nanograms per milliliter in terms of concentration in plasma. And what's interesting there is that by the time we stop the infusion in 10 or 20 minutes, within about 40 minutes, that patient is back to baseline, more or less. Psilocybin orally hasn't even started by that point, right? So from a practicality perspective, from a cost efficiency perspective, this is a strictly dominant solution. And fundamentally, what we need to prove is that this type of short but intense drug effect is going to have the same type of antidepressant efficacy. And if we demonstrate that, then this becomes the de facto solution, we believe, for psychedelic drug therapy. And so that's the label that we're going for. It's a treatment of major depressive disorder via 10 to 20 minute infusion. The dosage itself is relatively small, 1 to 5 milligrams. And we believe that this type of approach is going to have a significant advantage from a cost efficiency perspective. We are launching the trials in July. So we have received favorable FDA feedback on our clinical development program. We are submitting a clinical trial application literally next week. And first patient, first visit is in July. The key readouts will be in December. And that will be, was our assumption about the pharmacokinetics, the safety and tolerability correct? Do we see antidepressant effect in a small population of patients with major depressive disorder? If the answer is yes to both, then from an investor perspective, this company is poised to have a massive inflection in valuation, because what we have demonstrated is we have a modern drug therapy. We have a modern drug therapy that is reliable, that is consistent, that is cost effective, and crucially, addresses this last mile challenge. The last mile challenge that I saw back in 2008, the last mile challenge that we saw firsthand when we were conducting our LSD trials in 2016. And that last mile challenge is fundamentally this. How do you make this more like a dentist appointment and less like a surgery? Not just from a commitment of time, but from a cost perspective. If you have to negotiate rates with Blue Cross Blue Shield, you have to make sure that you're getting a kind of cost benefit for that payer. And the only way to do that is by making sure that you have a consistent treatment where you don't have 1/3 of patients not responding because they don't get enough of the drug. You have to have a treatment that is relatively efficient. It comes on quickly, comes off quickly. And so those are the fundamental constraints that we are solving for. Now, from an IP perspective, we received notice of allowance on our psilocin salt, which means that generic competition would have to try to copy that salt to be an interchangeable generic, and we think that's going to be very difficult. Therefore, we think this is a very interesting and attractive IP position for commercialization. IP shouldn't steer the ship, but IP keeps the ship afloat. And we believe that from this perspective, compared to other companies in this space, we believe we have a very attractive IP position because of this. And so to wrap up, what's the opportunity? If you have depression, you're at 20 times greater risk of suicide. Depression is the leading cause of disability globally. And depression is just the first indication where psychedelics have demonstrated a rapid and robust clinical benefit. There is a massive, massive potential. The key is, how do you make it a modern medicine? How do you make it reliable? How do you make it short-acting? How do you make it cost-effective? How do you make it accessible through the existing infrastructure? And we believe that Eleusis does just that. And rather than our belief, we'll have the data by the end of the year. And so we believe that investors at this point would be well positioned for that inflection by the end of the year, because we're going to be generating the results which we think back up the simulations. Now, psilocybin has been delivered via infusion in the past, twice. Once in Switzerland in 1997 in a university study in Basel, and then the second time was in Imperial College as part of their brain imaging studies. Now, why did they choose an infusion of psilocybin versus giving it orally for that brain imaging study? Well, if you've ever seen an fMRI, it's a massive machine. It's a very expensive machine. You don't have it for very much time because you're typically competing with other scientists for that machine. When you deliver psilocybin via infusion, you knew that those volunteers who are going to get their brains imaged had enough drug on board to get the effect that you wanted to see. It was reliable. That reliability is going to translate in the clinic, because when you're a clinician, when you're operating a clinic, you need to make sure that you're getting a reliable effect without variability on the schedule of the clinic. And this is where clinical operations informs drug development. It tells us what we need to deliver, not just for patients, but for the clinicians that are going to be delivering this drug therapy. Now, we hired the supervising psychiatrist of the Imperial College studies, and he's a medical director in our company. And he described the experience of getting psilocybin via infusion. He said he definitely preferred it to the oral. And why? Because when the infusion started, the drug effects came on almost immediately. So within 2 minutes, they got to the peak effect of the drugs. So first off, there's no waiting around. There's no wondering, is the drug, am I feeling it? Am I not feeling it? You know. Number two, when the infusion stops, the drug effects come off relatively quickly, which means that there's no waiting around for the drug effect to kind of slowly dissipate. And then finally, from an operational perspective, and this is really quite crucial, he knew when the patients were ready to go into the fMRI machine. If you operate a clinic, knowing when a patient is ready to go home, knowing when a patient has received the proper dose, those are the questions that we're going to be answering. These are practical questions, but fundamentally, these are the practical questions which make this type of drug therapy something that's not just a niche therapy for a very few, but becomes a broadly accessible therapy for everyone in the United States who has private insurance. That's the goal of Eleusis, and that's what we're seeking to solve. Thank you very much.